The reading for this morning is taken from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, verses 30 through 34 and 53 through 56. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns that arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The word of the Lord. I spent a large part of my life trying to figure out just the right daily routine to have, the perfect daily routine. Maybe that comes from having an organized nature. I know that my parents certainly preferred order and regularity. My sister jokes that we had lunch every day at 12:01 and dinner at 6:02. I think that probably reflects more of her own preference for spontaneity, but there is some truth to what she has to say. When I was teaching, I always had a very detailed syllabus that told me just what I was going to be doing every day so that I knew. And while the students took their final exam, I would write for myself what I called closing comments on what went well and what needed to be changed. And after many years, I finally had my courses right where I wanted them, fully organized. The Old Testament passage will be read in church this morning is a story about David wanting to build a temple, a house for God. And I suspect that David's desire for that temple or that house is a bit of getting things organized as well as some guilt, because David had built himself a very nice palace, so perhaps at this point he needed to provide a place for God as well. But God had a different idea. Through the prophet Nathan, he said, "No, it's not time for temple building." One gets the impression that God didn't want to be confined. "Since the day I brought the people up out of Egypt," God said, "I have been moving about." Someday temple building would be appropriate, but not today. Instead, God offered to establish David's house, that is, his kingdom, forever. And as Christians, we see that fulfillment of that promise through the coming of Jesus Christ. Like God, Jesus himself also seems to be continually on the move. Today's gospel reading emphasizes that. Jesus had sent out the apostles 2 by 2, and now they had come back to report. Sensing their weariness, he suggested that they go off to a place by themselves and get some rest. But unfortunately, a great crowd followed them, so Jesus felt obliged to teach them. Today's lectionary skips over what came next, the feeding of the 5,000, and instead keeps Jesus on the move, going across the sea once again to heal in cities and villages and farms. Just reading it makes one tired. It's also the opposite of reworking a syllabus until it's perfect. In all the gospel stories, there's only one in which Jesus has to try twice. In the healing of a blind man, the first time the blind man says, "Well, I see people walking, but they're like trees." So Jesus has to put his hands on him again and complete the healing so the man has full sight. Jesus had to do it in a 2-stage process, but one gets the feeling that it really had something more to do with the man himself or with the situation than with Jesus. For the most part, he simply went out and healed and preached and taught. The disciples did need some training, and sometimes they stumbled, but by and large, they followed along in Jesus' footsteps, doing the same thing. I take 2 lessons from today's readings. One is that God refuses to be confined. Certainly there are places where God feels closer to one. I hope the Trinity Cathedral is one of those places. But God will not be confined. God will not be limited. God is everywhere present, bidden or unbidden, as an old saying puts it. And that means we need to get out of the cathedral building. We need to get out into the neighborhood, into the places where we live and shop and play and encounter others, and look for God there. We need to ask ourselves, what is God doing here? What is God up to now in this place? The second lesson that I got out of this is that the life of faith will never be perfect. I will never get it so right that I can just relax and coast. There are no closing comments that I can write down every day that will help me fine-tune my faith disciplines until I don't have to strive anymore. And that's a blow to my organizing ego. I'm never going to get it right. I have to keep trying, keep putting energy into this life of faith. I have to keep asking myself, what does God want me to do now? The upside of both of those lessons is that they create a much richer life than a static, complacent one. Looking for God everywhere is a way to find joy. Asking what God would have me do now brings direction and commitment to my life. The collects for last Sunday and for this Sunday really reinforce those realizations. Last week we prayed to know what we ought to do and to ask God for the grace to do it. This week we request that God gives us those things for which we are unworthy, and also gives us those things that we are too blind to ask. If God grants us all of that, we will be well on our way to recognizing the riches of Jesus Christ, whether we're organized or not. Amen.